seated herself behind him, and as he rocked back she caught his hair between her finger and thumb, so that it tugged him as he swung forward again. He took no notice. There was only the sound of the rockers on the floor. In silence, like a crab, Gudrun caught a strand of his hair each time he rocked back. Ursula flushed and sat in some pain. She saw the irritation gathering on his brow. At last he leapt up, suddenly, like a steel spring going off, and stood on the hearthrug. "Damn it, why can't I rock?" he asked, petulantly, fiercely. Ursula loved him for his sudden, steel-like start out of the languor. He stood on the hearthrug fuming, his eyes gleaming with anger. Gudrun laughed in her deep, mellow fashion. "Men don't rock themselves," she said. "Girls don't pull men's hair," he said. Gudrun laughed again. Ursula sat amused but waiting, and he knew Ursula had to go to her, to follow her call. Once he drove her to Derby in the dog-cart. He belonged to the horsey set of the sappers. They had lunch in an inn, and went through the market, pleased with everything. He bought her a copy of Wuthering Heights from a bookstall. Then they found a little fair in progress, and she said, "My father used to take me in the swing boats." "Did you like it?" he asked. "Oh, it was fine," she said. "Would you like to go now?" "Love it," she said, though she was afraid. But the prospect of doing an unusual, exciting thing was attractive to her. He went straight to the stand, paid the money, and helped her to mount. He seemed to ignore everything but just what he was doing. Other people were mere objects of indifference to him. She would have liked to hang back, but she was more ashamed to retreat from him than to expose herself to the crowd, or to dare the swing boat. His eyes laughed, and standing before her with his sharp, sudden figure, he set the boat swing. Sharp, sudden figure, he set the boat swinging. She was not afraid, she was thrilled. His colour flushed, his eyes shone with a roused light, and she looked up at him, her face like a flower in the sun, so bright and attractive. So they rushed through the bright air, up at the sky as if flung from a catapult, then falling terribly back. She loved it. The motion seemed to fan their blood to fire. They laughed, feeling the flames. After the swing boats they went on the roundabouts to calm down, he twisting astride on his jerky wooden steed towards her, and always seeming at his ease, enjoying himself. A zest of antagonism to the convention made him fully himself. As they sat on the whirling carousel, with the music grinding out, she was aware of the people on the earth outside, and it seemed that he and she were riding carelessly over the faces of the crowd, riding forever proudly, gallantly, over the upturned faces of the crowd, moving on a high level, spurning the common mass. When they must descend and walk away, she was unhappy, feeling like a giant suddenly cut down to ordinary level, at the mercy of the mob. They left the fair, to return for the dog-cart. Passing the large church, Ursula must look in, but the whole interior was filled with scaffolding. Fallen stone and rubbish were heaped on the floor, bits of plaster crunched underfoot, and the place re-echoed to the calling of secular voices and to blows of the hammer. She had come to plunge in the utter gloom and peace for a moment, bringing all her yearning, that had returned on her uncontrolled after the reckless riding over the face of the crowd in the fair. After pride she wanted comfort, solace, for pride and scorn seemed to hurt her most of all. And she found the immemorial gloom full of bits of falling plaster and dust of floating plaster, smelling of old lime, having scaffolding and rubbish heaped about, dust cloths over the altar. "Let us sit down a minute," she said. They sat unnoticed in the back pew, in the gloom, and she watched the dirty, disorderly work of bricklayers and plasterers. Workmen in heavy boots, walking, grinding down the aisles, calling out in a vulgar accent, "Hi mate, has them coal and mouldings come?" There were shouts of coarse answer from the roof of the church. The place echoed desolate. Skrebensky sat close to her. Everything seemed wonderful, if dreadful to her. The world tumbling into ruins, and she and he clambering unhurt, lawless over the face of it all. He sat close to her, touching her, and she was aware of his influence upon her. But she was glad. It excited her to feel the press of him upon her. being were urging her to something. As they drove home he sat near to her, and when he swayed to the cart, he swayed in a voluptuous, lingering way against her, lingering as he swung away to recover balance. Without speaking, he took her hand across, under the wrap, and with his unseeing face lifted to the road, his soul intent, he began with his one hand to unfasten the buttons of her glove, to push back her glove from her hand, carefully laying bare her hand. And the close working, instinctive subtlety of his fingers upon her hand sent the young girl mad with voluptuous delight. His hand was so wonderful, intent as a living creature, skillfully pushing and manipulating in the dark underworld, removing her glove and laying bare her palm, her fingers. Then his hand closed over hers, so firm, so close, as if the flesh knitted to one thing, hand and hers. Meanwhile his face watched the road and the ears of the horse. He drove with steady attention through the villages, and she sat beside him, rapt, glowing, blinded with a new light. Neither of them spoke. In outward attention they were entirely separate, but between them was the compact of his flesh with hers, in the hand-clasp. Then, in a strange voice, affecting nonchalance and superficiality, he said to her, "Sitting in the church there reminded me of Ingram." "Who is Ingram?" she asked. She also affected calm superficiality, but she knew that something forbidden was coming. "He is one of the other men with me down at Chatham. A subaltern, but a year older than I am." "And why did the church remind you of him?" "Well, he had a girl in Rochester, and they always sat in a particular corner in the cathedral for their love-making." "How nice!" she cried impulsively. They misunderstood advantages, though. The verger made a row about it. "What a shame! Why shouldn't they sit in a cathedral?" "I suppose they all think it a profanity, except you and Ingram and the girl." "I don't think it's a profanity. I think it's right to make love in a cathedral." She said this almost defiantly, in despite of her own soul. He was silent. "And was she nice?" "Who? Emily?" "Yes, she was rather nice. She was a milliner, and she wouldn't be seen in the streets with Ingram. It was rather sad, really, because the verger spied on them, and got to know their names, and then made a regular row. It was a common tale afterwards." "What did she do?" "She went to London, into a big shop. Ingram still goes up to see her." "Does he love her?" "It's 1.5 years he's been with her now." "What was she like?" "Emily? Little, shy, violet sort of girl, with nice eyebrows." Ursula meditated this. It seemed violet sort of girl, with nice eyebrows. Ursula meditated this. It seemed like real romance of the outer world. "Do all men have lovers?" she asked, amazed at her own temerity. But her hand was still fastened with his, and his face still had the same unchanging fixity of outward calm. "They're always mentioning some amazing fine woman or other, and getting drunk to talk about her. Most of them dash up to London the moment they are free." "What for?" "To some amazing fine woman or other." "What sort of woman?" "Various. Her name changes pretty frequently as a rule. One of the fellows is a perfect maniac. He keeps a suitcase always ready, and the instant he is at liberty, he bolts with it to the station, and changes in the train. No matter who is in the carriage, off he whips his tunic, and performs at least the top half of his toilet." Ursula quivered and wondered. "Why is he in such a hurry?" she asked. Her throat was becoming hard in his mind, I suppose. She was chilled, hardened, and yet this world of passions and lawlessness was fascinating to her. It seemed to her a splendid recklessness. Her adventure in life was beginning. It seemed very splendid. That evening she stayed at the Marsh till after dark, and Skrebensky escorted her home. For she could not go away from him, and she was waiting for something more. In the warm of the early night, with the shadows new about them, she felt in another, harder, more beautiful, less personal world. Now a new state should come to pass. He walked near to her, and with the same silent, intent approach put his arm round her waist, and softly, very softly, drew her to him, till his arm was hard and pressed in upon her. She seemed to be carried along, floating, her feet scarce touching the ground, borne upon the firm ground. borne upon the firm, moving surface of his body, upon whose side she seemed to lie, in a delicious swoon of motion. And whilst she swooned, his face bent nearer to her, her head was leaned on his shoulder. She felt his warm breath on her face. Then softly, oh softly, so softly that she seemed to faint away, his lips touched her cheek, and she drifted through strands of heat and darkness. Still she waited in her swoon and her drifting, waited, like the sleeping beauty in the story. She waited, and again his face was bent to hers. His lips came warm to her face. Their footsteps lingered and ceased. They stood still under the trees, whilst his lips waited on her face, waited like a butterfly that does not move on a flower. She pressed her breast a little nearer to him. He moved, put both his arms round her, and drew her close. And then, in the darkness, he bent to her mouth, softly, and touched her mouth with his mouth. She was afraid. She lay still on his arm, feeling his lips on her lips. She kept still, helpless. Then his mouth drew near, pressing open her mouth. A hot, drenching surge rose within her. She opened her lips to him in pained, poignant eddies. She drew him nearer. She let him come farther. His lips came and surging, soft, oh soft, yet oh like the powerful surge of water, irresistible, till with a little blind cry she broke away. She heard him breathing heavily, strangely beside her. A terrible and magnificent sense of his strangeness possessed her. But she shrank a little now, within herself. Hesitating, they continued under the ash trees of the hill, where her grandfather had walked with his daffodils to make his proposal, and where her mother had gone with her young husband, walking close upon him as Ursula was now walking upon Skrebensky. Ursula was aware of the dark limbs of the trees stretching overhead, clothed with leaves, and of fine ash leaves.
Hast du das Sweatshirt gesehen?